Welcome to the July edition of Casita Coalition's 2024 webinar series on ADUs and middle housing. I'm Rafael Perez, Casita Coalition Board Chair. A brief word about us. Casita Coalition is a 501c3 multi-sector nonprofit working to foster resilient communities by championing diverse housing solutions that empower neighborhoods to thrive. Through our core strategies of narrative work, systems change, capacity building, policy reform, and technical assistance, we catalyze innovative housing solutions. We are grateful to our major funders, the San Francisco Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, as well as to our webinar sponsors, the California Building Industry Association, AARP California, the Law Office of Rubin, Junius, and Rose, and Clean Bio Capital Management. To save time, bioinformation for presenters will be in the chat. As a reminder, if attendees could use the Q&A feature for their questions, not the chat, it would be appreciated. Today's presenters and panelists are subject matter experts in small lot subdivisions and other land division options. Why is this important? The high cost of housing in California is driven by many factors, not the least of which is the high cost of land. Subdividing a parcel into smaller lots can help in two ways: by creating the opportunity for more homes on a given parcel of land, and for those homes to be sold on their own lot, and by lowering the land cost for each home, which brings down the overall cost. Please note that our guidance memo represents Casita Coalition positions, but other presenters today will be sharing their own organization's recommendations, which may differ. Our first presenter is John Kevlin, partner at Rubin, Junius, and Rose. John will share our new guidance memo on implementing SB 684, a bill passed last year to create a simplified ministerial process for small lot subdivision projects.
Great. Thank you, Rafael. Thanks to the Casita Coalition for putting this webinar on. Very excited to present this next program in a line of programs we've been seeing out of the state legislature over the course of now the last 5, 6, 7 years. SB 35 kind of being the most well-known and first of them. But as we've seen the legislature recognizing we have a housing crisis and starting to identify certain categories of projects where if you fit within the eligibility factors, we get you out of CEQA, we get discretionary, very specifically define the quote-unquote box you need to fit into to be a project that achieves this streamlined approval. So SB 684 is the next in the line of these streamlining programs. And as everyone, I'm sure on the webinar today knows, is that this is for 10-unit project, different than previous programs, which had focused on affordable housing, supportive housing, housing owned by on sites of educational institutions or religious institutions, as well as along commercial corridors. So if I could get the next slide, please. So the high level of what we're talking about here is that SB 684 gets you this streamlined ministerial approval for a very specific scenario where you have a combination of a parcel map, subdividing land up to 10 parcels, and that you are proposing a housing development on each of those parcels. This is kind of the carve out that the state legislature created for SB 684 for this streamlined processing. Next slide, please. So again, what do we know about ministerial approvals? No CEQA review, no discretionary review, planning commission or city council or board of supervisors hearings, no public noticing or hearings, and no community review. Next slide. So let's start getting into the qualifying characteristics for defining what is eligible for a 684 project. The first is that the site has to be zoned to allow multifamily residential. It would need to create 10 or fewer parcels or units. The parcel size can only be 5 acres or less, no larger than 5 acres. Similar to the other programs, 75% of the perimeter must have urban uses, and the parcel has to be in an urban area, right? We're talking about infill development here to get this streamlined approval. And you cannot be using a lot that was previously split by using SB9, which was the single family home duplex streamlining program that was enacted a couple of years ago by the legislature. Next slide, please. The newly formed lots have to be at least 600 square feet, unless it's otherwise allowed to be smaller by the local agency. The average unit size of the new homes on these sites cannot be more than 1750 square feet. So that's kind of an upper threshold of how large the housing is allowed to be on these sites. And as you can imagine, from a size like that, we're talking about more closer to middle income housing and not larger homes. The site has to be served by public water and sewer, and it also has to comply with any local conclusionary ordinances, many of which get triggered at just 5 units. Next slide, please. We've got our what are becoming kind of standard environmental standards in terms of for eligibility. Again, this started with SB 35 and has continued through where we take certain sites out of being eligible for these. Prime farmland, wetlands, very high fire hazard severity zone, hazardous waste site, earthquake fault zone, flood hazard area, floodway, conservation area, or habitat for protected species. We just take these off the map in terms of eligibility because they do raise specific, unique environmental concerns. The project has to meet the objective requirements of the Subdivision Map Act, so you're still filing a subdivision application as you typically would under a typical project. And there's no homeowners association required unless otherwise required by the Davis-Sterling Act. And that's starting to really get into the weeds here. Next slide, please. This is really what we're finding is one of the real cruxes of the usefulness of SB 684, which is that there are minimum density requirements. And there's 2 categories. The first category has your site been identified in the most recently adopted housing elements, all of which should, not all of them have, but should be adopted by now, and should be, if they haven't by now, will be in the near future. These sites, if they're identified in the housing inventory, the density provided needs to be at least the density that is expected under the housing element. Why is that an issue? Because SB 684 only allows up to 10 units. There are circumstances where you might not be able to achieve the density under the housing element with any given site just because it's a site identified by the housing element and a specific density was set. So in many cases, this is going to be trying to kind of fit a 10-unit project into what the housing element density is, and that may or may not work. Next slide. Oh, sorry. If we can go back, sorry, the last bullet point was the other category is if your site was not identified in the housing element, then you need to meet maximum allowable residential density, and so under the zoning code. So again, that may be an issue on certain sites because SB 684 can only do 10 units, up to 10 units. Next slide. The resulting housing will either be fee simple ownership lots. It can be part of a common interest development. It can be part of a housing cooperative. It can also be owned by a community land trust. So there's a number of different models that can be used here. Next slide. Just like a number of other of the streamlining programs, SB 684 protects against the loss of protected units. We can't alter or demolish existing deed restricted affordable housing units or units under rent control. and will also not alter or demolish units rented within the previous 5 years, so a less than 5-year vacancy, or were vacated via the Ellis Act within the last 15 years. Next slide. So let's get into some of the restrictions on the local agencies, because this really starts defining what these projects can look like. The standards that preclude, yeah, okay. So minimum dimensions of the lot, they can't put any restrictions on it other than the 600 square foot minimum. There cannot be standards in the zoning code of a local agency that only apply to 684 projects, right? You can't carve out special rules that just apply to 684, right? And this is trying to ensure that local agencies, in fact, do comply with the statewide program. The setbacks, local agencies can require setbacks up to those allowed by SB 9, which are 4 foot both on the side and rear setbacks, but that's the extent of setbacks allowed. And they cannot require covered or enclosed parking or parking beyond the SB 9 rules, which is 1 per unit, or if you're near transit, none per unit. Next slide. And this is kind of the critical gating factor, other than the 1750 square foot maximum average size, which is there is an FAR limitation on these sites. It's a one FAR limit for sites of 3 to 7 units, for projects of 3 to 7 units, and 1.25 for projects of 8 to 10 units. Next slide. Where so what authority does the local agency have? They can deny projects with a specific adverse impact to public health and safety, right? So this isn't the CEQA standard. This isn't likelihood of a significant effect. This is Housing Accountability Act standard, specific adverse impact to public health and safety. It's a very high standard. And the local agency may adopt a local implementation ordinance, and to the degree they do, such adoption is not subject to CEQA itself. Next slide. There's a couple of provisions in SB 684 which expressly allow the agency to do something, but they don't have to. And as the Casita Coalition, as our group has looked at this, we've got some policy positions here. A local agency may deny ADUs on SB 684 projects, so but they don't have to. So you are allowed to create the 10 units on 10 lots, and you can allow the ADUs. Obviously, we're in favor of greater housing and think the ADUs can really heighten the benefit of the 684 program. Local agency may deny SB 9 lot splits on parcels created through SB 684. So this can further increase density beyond the basic 10 units of SB 684. And then the last one is you'll have to read it a couple times to really wrap your head around it. But a local agency may, but is not required to, condition a final map on the units being built before the final map is recorded. We see this as being a problem for a number of reasons. One of the really most simple is that what this means is that the units on, if this type of condition gets applied to a project, it means the units all have to be built before you can actually start final parcelization and sale or transfer of these units. This really places a limitation upfront on potential transfers of 684 property to a 684 developer. It has problems with financing upfront. So this is one of those provisions where local agencies are expressly allowed to do this, but we really feel that there's a number of reasons why it would really undermine the goals of 684. Next slide, please. And again, as Raphael mentioned, we put together a guidance memo. We actually just issued it this morning. So please feel free to download that and review it. And obviously, myself and the Casita Coalition are here to discuss any questions folks have as time goes on and in this webinar. Thanks, everyone.
And next up, we have Nolan Gray.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nolan Gray. I'm the Research Director of California MB. And thanks for having me here. And sorry for the background noise. I'm having a crazy everything goes wrong travel day. Can we advance to the next slide? Great. So just to reinforce some of what was previously discussed here, right now we're in the implementation phase. So as of July 1st, SB 684 is state law. And so every jurisdiction is required to implement. They're not required to adopt an implementing ordinance. We strongly encourage jurisdictions to adopt an implementing ordinance. And that's, of course, exempt from CEQA if they choose to do it, but they're not required. But should your jurisdiction or jurisdiction you work with be interested in adopting such a ordinance, a couple things that we recommend. So as the previous speaker suggested, we recommend not conditioning final map on COO being administered. This was mainly added in because certain interest had an issue with the concern over phantom lots. We're looking to revisit this in future legislation, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, but do not necessarily need to condition final map on a COO being issued. Second is local jurisdictions have wide discretion over whether or not they allow ADUs and JADUs. So we recommend that jurisdictions allow ADUs. They can combine this also with AB 1033, which will allow them to condoize them and create homeownership units potentially. This is all voluntary, but again, just one way to get the most out of the law. Another thing that jurisdictions can do is allow 10 units on all lots. So the law only guarantees Mullen densities, which is 30 units per acre in an urban jurisdiction, 20 in a suburban jurisdiction, and then 10 to 15 in many other parts of the state. But if you adopt an implementing ordinance, a jurisdiction can allow up to 10 units on every lot using SB 10, which of course also exempts these types of ordinances from CEQA. So you can allow up to 10 units on all lots. As far as the shot clock provisions in the bill, which are very important, jurisdictions can, of course, process applications quicker than 60 days. So Sacramento, for example, moves some of these similarly situated types of projects through the pipeline much, much quicker. Then, of course, just vanilla things for true of all projects. Minimizing fees, the goal here is to create starter homes, and the more fees that are assessed against these projects, that's all price increases that fall on the backs of new homeowners, as well as avoiding offsite improvements unless absolutely necessary. Next slide, please. So of course, this is not a perfect bill, and we've been tracking things that need to get fixed here. This legislative session, we have SB 1123. It doesn't fix and expand everything that we'd like with the law, but it does solve a few important issues. So there's going to be cleanup regarding the language that affects tenancies in common. So those will be explicitly allowed form of project using 684. Clarify some of the land about land ownership for land trust. We're adding a definition of net habitable floor area, and then we're clarifying that jurisdictions cannot mandate frontage. Another important change is clarifying that should jurisdictions choose to allow ADUs, they're exempt from the 10 unit maximum that otherwise applies to these projects. We are also going to be allowing additional flexibility with those with that minimum density mandate. So for example, as the previous speaker mentioned, if a site is not in a RHNA housing element, it has to, under the current law, it has to build as many units as are allowed under the current zoning. We know that flexibility with these lots is important. The concern here from some groups was that folks would use this to underbuild sites that have more capacity. That standard will be changing to a 66% of the zone capacity. The idea being to add a little bit more flexibility. We're clarifying that this is not yet in the bill. We're discussing this. We're looking to add a 30-day shot clock for deeming an application complete, just to make sure that certain bad actor cities don't shift the delays to the application phase. And then the big one, the really, really important change with SB 1123 that's drawing a lot of our attention is frankly why we're not tackling a whole bunch of other things with this law this year is adding vacant single family zoned lots into the bill. This is very important for some of our equity partners. Now, what do we mean? How do we define vacant? Other factors? We're still hammering out the details, but I would encourage folks to stay involved on that. Next slide, please. And finally, I would just say, as you all, whether you're a planning practitioner or a developer, we need you to get involved. We know that this law, there's elements of it that we need to continue to clean up. There's areas of it that we'd really like to continue to expand. And so if there's anything that you encounter that would be good for us to know, we'd love to hear from you. As with ADUs, as our friends over at Casita know, reform is a process. So we're looking to continue that process in future sessions. My email's there, and thanks again for having me, and I'm more than happy to help out with any questions or concerns folks have.
Thanks, Nolan. Next up, we have Paul Steidel.
Hi there, this is Paul Steidel. You can go to the next slide. So I'm a licensed architect, co-founder of Build Casa. I'm excited to share some information about both what we do, a couple examples of projects that we've taken through the SB9 subdivision process. And then we also have a couple thoughts on SB 684 that touch on some of the topics that we've just been looking at. You can see here, we're on a mission to build 100,000 homes and do that in existing neighborhoods. We think this is a core way of increasing housing supply in the cities that we love and care about, and that there's the existing infrastructure in place to support these additional units. So this is kind of the vision of where we see those new homes filling in. You can go to the next slide. So we've run a statewide analysis of where the best properties with the highest potential for new infill housing. And if you go to the next slide, there's a static version of this that shows some of our analysis, focuses on the desirability, not just the kind of size of the backyard, but also, you can see that corners here are identified in yellow. We've got alley access on the blue ones. The red lots are more, flag lot configurations. And so we look into the projected size of property that can be built, the expected unit size that's, supported by that property, and then the access to get to it, to identify the best opportunities for infill housing. Next. Our core business model, we work with those homeowners that have really, excellent lot opportunities for building infill housing. And we purchase an option on that extra lot space. And a lot of times this is land that has grass that's overgrown, and folks see the value in doing this, but don't have the resources to take on a project like this. So that's where we serve a purpose of splitting and entitling a new development on that property at no cost to them, and then facilitating that transaction on the extra lot space to a builder who's intending on building that entitled design. Next. We take a lot of inspiration from the infill housing that came before us. We don't think that there's a reason to reinvent the wheel here. A lot of I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, here with this group, but there's really excellent examples of infill housing that add a lot of character to our existing neighborhoods. These are both in my community in Oakland, of a side-by-side and an up-down duplex. And we think that adds a lot of the intangible qualities that we like about our walkable communities, and also increases the density level to support things like, corner store retail and coffee shops, which we think is a really vital element to urban life. Next. So with that in mind, our approach to our architectural approach has been, to start with core typologies that work on a number of those different types of lot arrangements that we looked at before. So 3-story townhouses, 2-story townhouses, stacked up-down duplexes, a range of single-family home options. These would all go on that secondary lot created by SB9. We use this as the starting point for thinking through, can this unit size be supported on the lot, but it's also used as the basis of design for the entitlement of the building as well. But oftentimes that branches out into a range of different design options based on these starting points. Next. So wanted to show a couple examples of SB9 subdivision process. So this is an example of an SB9 lot split process that we took all the way through tentative parcel map approval, final parcel map, and it has been recorded. Now we're going to be entering the building permit phase for the entitled building design. Like I was speaking to earlier, the benefit here is that the existing house and garage are completely untouched. And if you're familiar with SB9, you can see there that the new lot is exactly 40.06% of the original. And so that's meeting the minimum lot size requirements. And that's what we created for parcel 2. Next. Then in terms of the design that we've entitled for this lot, it's an up-down duplex. This particular one is a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. We do our best to stack plumbing, keep the designs relatively simple, but these are going to be 2 really great infill, starter home sized units in an existing neighborhood where there isn't a lot of new housing being built because most of the lots have already been built out. So we're really excited about that possibility. And just squinting at the site plan, we think it's incredibly reasonable to be adding a unit of this size to a property, because this was previously just a big flat backyard that did not have any productive housing on it. Next. The previous lot that we were looking at was on a corner, and so that had really desirable access characteristics. This is another example of a desirable access characteristic. So you've got the street on the left-hand side, the alley on the right. And so in this case, we're splitting off the 40% behind the existing home, behind the existing garage, and the access will be off of the finished alley in the neighborhood. Also about 40% as well. Next. Similar to the previous one, this is a stacked duplex design. This one's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, but it's a similar form factor, 800 square feet unit with exterior stair. And this is also in Sacramento. Next. And then just to share a little bit of information about SB 684, at the moment, the way that the law is currently written, there's no overlap. So it covers all residential districts between SB 9 and SB 684. But you can see here in most of our urban centers, like Los Angeles, there was a lot of the city that previously was not covered by the SB 9 regulation, but because of the multifamily zoning characteristics of 684, opens up wide areas of the city for similar streamlined process of up to 10 units. And so we're really excited about that possibility. Wanted to share a couple illustrations that touch on some of the topics that John and Nolan brought up earlier. So if you go to the next slide, it's really important to note that the majority of SB 684 eligible properties have an existing building on them. So if we're just looking at the universe of lots out there, we might think of 684 as kind of like a townhouse build. It's perfect for, a large, half-acre, 1-acre lot that can be subdivided and support 10 townhouses. And we think that's an excellent application of the law. But for the folks who are property owners, who have a large property in a multifamily district, and there's adequate area for additional units to be taken to the maximum zoning amount as permitted by the new regulation. We think that kind of represents both the median project and probably the majority of projects that will be taken on. There is a challenge with this. So if you go to the next slide, I'll illustrate what that is. And so here's an example where, let's say it's an alley lot. There's an existing quadplex in the front, and under SB 684, the supported density of the lot would allow for 2 additional 1,700 square foot townhomes. Now, there's some challenges if the certificate of occupancy is required in order to create those additional lots. So if you go to the next slide, I have a couple bullets here. This is the actual provision that states that the local agency may condition the approval and recordation on the completion of the structures. And the reason that we're recommending against this local opt-in measure is because, one, it creates a much higher barrier to entry for an existing property owner. If you own that quadplex, in order to benefit from 684, you need to basically build the entire units before you can split them off. And you don't have the ability to work with a partner to do the construction with a lender with those lots as subdivided, fee simple lots that can be built on. And so that complicates the lending process. I think that it will encourage the sale of the entire property, so that homeowners are kind of choosing between, should I just sell everything or should I do nothing, is kind of the challenge there. So we think that this opt-in measure will lead to, overall less housing production, and but we're excited about the possibility of doing this type of infill housing in the multifamily zones, just like we're doing with SB9. And then finally, last slide, just wanted to provide my contact information. I know there's a lot of builders, developers that are interested in this kind of infill housing development. We're always looking for those partners, and also in the case that we are doing some fee building ourselves, looking for great fee build partners across the state. So feel free to reach out, and we're happy to share more information. And I believe Mohammed's next in the order, so I'm going to go pass it on to him.
Thank you, Paul. Am I spotlighted and stuff? Yeah, awesome. Nice to meet everyone here. Thank you for joining this webinar during the Olympics opening ceremony. But you know what? This is more important. We got to solve this housing crisis. I'm policy associate at UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing Innovation, and also Casita Coalition board member. Next. So I'll go over basically the implementation of SB9. Now we have this exciting new bill, which is SB 684, and it's up to cities to choose how they implement it. This will be based on research that I conducted on SB9 a few years ago. What are some of the limitations that local governments have placed on SB9 implementation, and why there has been such a slow uptick? I also want to state, you have the people who wrote the bills, you have practitioners here. For any planners out there, I would really listen to their recommendations, just because they actually have to go build the housing. Next slide. So we found SB9 had potential. About 1% of single-family parcels were eligible. About 480,000 homes could be feasibly built throughout the state of California, but there were some loopholes, right? There was a lot of discretion given to local governments, and even at the more local level, HOAs and CCNRs could restrict SB9 law splits. Next slide. So we see about 300 SB9 units last year, according to APR data, and the data collection of those parcels that were labeled as SB9 aren't the best indicator, which is why I haven't updated this paper since. But right now what we're seeing is SB9 is having a slow uptick, but what was the original intent, right? The original intent was that, unlike SB 684, which is focused on multifamily zones and multifamily parcels, SB9 allowed it in single family zone. The local jurisdictions could have adopted the law as is or created a custom implementation ordinance. At the end result, this is going to be a ministerial process where varying levels of local discretion could apply, but it just could not physically preclude the ability to build a duplex on the back lot or to change the existing home to a duplex. So now we have 500 local jurisdictions hoping to apply SB9 in the best way possible. Next slide. Giving them the benefit of the doubt. SB9 was 2 units per lot could be built for total. Local governments have the discretion of that being a single family home with an ADU or a duplex. Some jurisdictions have outright banned ADU developments for SB9 lot splits. The legality of that is, of course, just sort of wait and see when it comes to enforcement. But the minimum lot size of the new lot developed has to be about 40% of the existing parcel, no less than 1,200 square feet. The minimum unit size is 800 square feet for that new unit. It's supposed to have a homeowner occupancy requirement, so homeowner must live there for 3 years. and side and rear setbacks are set at a 4-foot maximum. Parking is not required if you're within half a mile of public transit or car share. The big things that we learned through ADU laws, which is affordability requirements and impact fees, were not implemented with SB 9. It's very easy for a local government to state that affordable housing must be built without any public subsidy on these new units. And also impact fees for the construction of these units could range up to, I've seen, $300,000 a new unit. Next slide. So the common areas that we've seen in the 10 local jurisdictions that implemented SB 9 ordinances in 2022 is that cities that did not want much SB 9 development found ways to prevent it from happening. They had height limitations. They made the minimum unit size the maximum unit size, so you could only build 800 square foot units. There would be design requirements on just the architectural design of the building with materials that don't really exist anymore but must fit with the existing neighborhood being implemented. There's affordability requirements where you have to build something that's affordable to 60% AMI with no public subsidy for the one unit that you're going to build. There were mandated requirements for open space and other uses that really limited applicability. So like a big open space courtyard in the middle of 2 units made a lot of parcels just ineligible. Really what we're seeing is that there's an unequal application of standards regarding SB 9 lot splits that don't apply to these localities when they build ADUs or single family homes. Next slide. Yeah, I went over some of these examples with the height standards. Front setbacks are a big part too. They would have a 50-foot front setback to prevent SB 9 developments. There are some things like easements that are, I mean, these might be a little accidental, but a little bit larger than what's required for a car to go through or for an emergency vehicle to go through, which made parcels ineligible, and the outright outlying of flag lots. Or the outlaw of parking, where you just can't have parking on a parcel and it's a very suburban, car-centric neighborhood. Recently, HCD, Housing Community Department of California, found that when it comes to offsite improvements, which SB 9 lot splits are not supposed to have a requirement for offsite improvements, that Quimby fees do not apply. So Quimby fees are similar to like park fees that could be opted in for a local jurisdiction. 2 days ago, HCD has said that Quimby fees don't apply to SB 9 developments, and that could save about $20,000 to $100,000 in fees for just one unit. Next slide. So here are some policy recommendations. Really, it comes to the planning level, it has to have a culture of yes when it comes to planning new housing. Build Casa's model is really focused on the presentation before me is really focused on more pro-housing cities to make this stuff work. There are some local jurisdictions that have lead into the law and have really helped with this implementation. Local governments could still utilize resources. HCD and ABAG have SB 9 templates, model ordinances, guidance memos. Local governments could create easy to read checklists, clear information on project timelines, things that really help homeowners utilize this law. There are local governments like San Jose that bring all the local agencies together that need to be to approve housing together one day out of the week to approve ADUs. The same thing could be done for SB 9 units. Local governments could collaborate with small builders, similar to Build Casa, or other practitioners. I believe Yardsworth is another one, or just small builders in the area to basically make sure that their local implementation builds more housing. And charging impact fees per square foot, or just having the same rules as you do for single family homes, would make a world's difference. Next slide. At the state level, SB 450 is still on the holdup. Everyone's waiting for it to move forward. It's the last year that it could move forward in the legislature. That's just the first step, making sure that single family zones and a permitting shot clock could be a part of the equation. Other aspects could be introduced into the law or in subsequent years, where it comes to open space requirements, height limits, standardized unit size maximum, a shot clock for final map processing, making so HOAs and CCNRs do not prevent SB9 lot splits, and eliminating affordability requirements without subsidy. Next slide. Thank you so much for having me. Subscribe to our newsletter. We publish research once a month. And I will pass it to Jill.
Hi, my name is Jill Kropp with Studio Kropp Architecture. I work in Portland, Oregon, where we've had some middle housing opportunities for the last 3 years or so. I work with a variety of developers. So I have kind of a unique perspective about different ways you can develop this kind of housing. So a very short history of the changes in zoning in Portland. The initial impetus for the change in zoning was one, getting more affordable housing going, but also people were getting really frustrated with these very large infill single family homes going in to older neighborhoods in Portland where they were very out of scale. They could sometimes be up to 3 or 4 stories, sort of depending on what the grade was. So both of those things influence the desire to allow increased density. So next slide, please. I'm going to present 2 projects that I've done recently. The first one is a 4-unit townhouse, and this one just went on the market this week, so I have kind of up-to-date information about it. So this is a interior lot. 4 units are kind of stacked back, and you enter on the side, as you can see from the smaller detail photo. And 2 bedrooms, 2.5 bath, about 1,000 square feet. So these ones, this project is going to be condo. So this particular client of mine, they still feel like a condo arrangement is just as useful as if you were to subdivide it into fee simple lots. The plan is to sell these for $429,000. And just for context, in this neighborhood around the corner, there is a house. It was built in 2019, but the current value is around, $760,000 for a house that's granted twice the size. But for someone who doesn't need all that space, this is a really great option. And as you can see in the picture, it's taller than the 1.5-story house next to it, which is a lot of City of Portland has these 1.5-story bungalow style houses. It is taller, but it's not outrageously huge. And then this one really looks like a single family home from the street, which is appealing to people who already live in the neighborhood. It doesn't really stand out as multifamily housing, so that's beneficial. Next slide. So this project, this is a cottage cluster project. As you can see, it's on a corner lot with 8 units. City of Portland was we only were allowed to do cottage clusters just in the last 2 years. But it is quickly becoming kind of the go-to for a lot of my clients. I think mainly because you can generally get the most units on a lot with a cottage cluster. And in this example, the corner lot is really kind of ideal for getting that kind of single family house look, even though they're much smaller units, because you can have the houses that are facing the street, and then there's just a few that are kind of an interior lot. So this one just broke ground. But my clients are anticipating that it would sell for around, this has a mix. There's 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 1 bedroom. So there's 1 3-bedroom. They think that one's going to sell for $429,000, 2 bedrooms for $329,000. And then in contrast, in this neighborhood, a new single family home that looks like just sold a couple years ago was for $520,000. So it feels like this is a different neighborhood than the other one. It's real estate. It's still sort of neighborhood dependent. The other one was a closer in to the center of the city, a more desirable neighborhood. So in this situation, they're less of a great deal, but they are still, like, for some people, I think 429 is a lot more accessible than 520. So a little bit about the process for subdivision. As I mentioned, this particular client, they're still doing everything as a condo. So that means you own, in the case of the cottage cluster, you own your house, and then the outdoor area is shared in common. Oregon, I think it was 2 years ago, started a process called a middle housing land division, that is specific kind of land division that's specific to this housing type. And it is something that you apply for concurrently with your building permit. So it might be hard to see, but there are little dashed lines in between each building, which is basically what is required kind of for the zoning, regardless of whether you do a land division or not. And so everything that's kind of within that square then can be created into its own lot, which doesn't have any of the rules of a more traditional land division, where you'd have to have street frontage. There'd be a minimum size that the lots can be. There's really just a lot of flexibility. I would say the only disadvantage to doing a middle housing land division versus condos is there's a kind of a more strict requirement for your water and sewer hookups. You have to have individual hookups for any house that faces the street. Whereas if this was a condo, you could have one sewer line from the street that then fed to each unit. And then you could have a combination of shared water services, shared water line where everyone got their own meter. So that's a big expense that comes in when you're doing the land division. Thing about the timeline for both processes, based on what my clients have told me, it's really very similar. They take the same amount of time, and usually you can do it while you're doing the permitting and construction, so that everything should be ready to go once you get your certificate of occupancy. The last thing that I will say is, some of the disadvantages to middle housing in general is if you're in some communities that don't have improved streets and sidewalks, you're required as a developer to upgrade those things, and that can sometimes be prohibitive for smaller scaled projects like this, that makes the project not pencil out. The advantages are this kind of housing it's simple single family home construction. So you don't have to have sprinklers unless you're too far away from a street. Very straightforward construction, that it's easy to find subs who can do it. So that's everything that I have for my presentation. Next up, we have Raphael.
All right, thank you. So now we're going to kick off our Q&A with a couple of questions on the subdivision process in Los Angeles with Derek Levitt, Director of Housing at Ehrlich Yanai Cheney Architects. So I'd like to welcome all of our presenters back for a roughly 15-minute Q&A. Attendees, please use your Q&A feature for your questions. And if you can keep them general, that will be most helpful. All right, Derek. So in your previous role with Motive, you went through the City of Los Angeles small lot subdivision process multiple times.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that process and how long the timelines were, if there were any discretionary reviews and hearings?
Yeah, sure. So, the city of LA was really the pioneer on small lot subdivision. At Motive, we probably did between 40 and 50 small lot subdivision projects over about a 12 to 14-year process. So a lot of them, but it was over 10 years, or right around 10 years ago when the ordinance came about. So again, an early pioneer. I think a lot of these new rules at the state level are probably going to change the approach. So while all the other panelists have spoken about the future of subdivision, I'm going to talk a little bit about the past. So I think a lot of this will change, but there were a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of surprises, not just to us, but mostly to the building department, to the planning department. When you create a new innovative idea, there's a lot of learning lessons along the way. A lot of times building codes don't line up with a planning idea. Trying to determine utilities can get very complicated. Gaps between buildings down to little details like how do you flash those and who approves it. From a timeline perspective, it was not ministerial at all. So I think the fastest that we got through it was about 10 months to the longest over 2 years. But there's a lot of variables in there, and I'm including the permitting process in that as well. You know, there's a tentative map and a final map and a lot of complications. But City of LA did some great things. They had expediting available, which basically they would assign you an expert planner to get you through the process. So in some of the cases, it was plan check that slowed us down, not necessarily the planning department. But it is a discretionary process, so not ministerial, not by right. So there was a public hearing. We would attend neighborhood councils to try to get the support of the surrounding neighbors. So in some ways, it's a lot of work, especially on the smaller ones. To do that for a 3 to 5 unit project was quite a bit of brain damage in some cases.
For those not familiar with the process, how would you describe the difference between a tentative map and a final map?
Yeah, so that was interesting too. I think, you know, in California, we're dictated by the California Map Act, which is basically the laws about subdivision. I don't think that those laws really anticipated a local city coming out with an urban infill option for subdivision. So trying to get those things to match up was sometimes challenging. The tentative map process or preliminary map process was really what would happen is we would design the project. We would have the subdivision engineer draft that preliminary or tentative map. You submit that to the city. In the case of small lot subdivision, you had to include the design of the building with that. So that's sort of the discretionary process did involve a little bit about the design of the project as well. You would do neighborhood outreach, you would go to a public hearing. The decision maker which was a planner at the city, would make the decision, essentially approving that tentative map. But then from there, you would go into plan check. And during the plan check process, and even during construction, would be when we would finalize the map. So the finalizing the map, a pretty tedious process. It would go to the various departments at the city. You know, they're all weighing in for very important decisions on subdividing land. But definitely a big difference between the old way that subdivision was done in the, you know, people doing tract homes to urban infill. There's a lot of differences.
Thank you. And now we have Jared from Casita Coalition who will be joining us for Q&A and to help moderate the questions in the chat and in the Q&A specifically. Is it Jared?
Yeah, and just kind of one more kind of basic question to get it out of the way before we jump into kind of more specifics about the legislation. But you know, obviously Casita has done a lot of work with ADUs, and we have a lot of experience with the ministerial process surrounding ADUs. But with land division and the mapping process being a more difficult or more complex process, what are the different professionals, teams that you need to bring in for someone that's looking to do a 684 project or an SB9 lot split? What are the different professionals? And that can go to any of the practitioners.
I might just hop in because I'm usually a discretionary player in the process, so you know, can talk to both sides as a land use attorney. So obviously you need a good architect, an architect that knows the law and can, you know, design the project accordingly. In some jurisdictions, you're going to find that the jurisdiction is welcoming, is going to be working with you. There's going to be, and in that case, typically an architect who is aware of SB 684, whatever other laws you're using, is going to be more than adequate. And honestly, you know, a land use lawyer can sometimes make things more complicated than necessary. On the flip side, there may be jurisdictions where They need some more education. That's actually a common thing with a lot of these new streamlined housing laws. This is completely different than local zoning. And so in a lot of cases, the city just needs, some education as to what these state laws require. And that's something a land use attorney can help with. And we also have, should expect to have jurisdictions that are a bit hesitant or reluctant to allow these types of laws or projects pursuant to these laws. And in those cases, having a land use attorney being able to kind of push on those on the legal requirements can be helpful. But a solid architect that's aware of the laws is really the key player here, and a land use attorney can be helpful as well. And then Derek or Jill, you guys might have some thoughts about needing to get a civil involved early on as well. But that's how I think a land use attorney can help.
Yeah, for sure. Your civil, or we would typically refer to them as a subdivision engineer. Very critical. That's something that can get messed up really easily. So someone with a lot of experience in that.
There's an interesting dynamic with some of these reforms that they're kind of tackling the planning approval side, but not really impacting the final map approval, which is some of the subject matter, Derek, that you were touching on with the Subdivision Map Act. And so previously in a discretionary process, the riskiest part of the process, the most unknowns was like, will this get approved? Like, will we be able to do this? And in our experience, we've found that has a lot more certainty if we're meeting the objective standards, which is great because that's consistent with the way that the law is written. However, the process of final mapping and going through development engineering oftentimes is the part that slows it down, because these reforms haven't actually impacted the timelines and the cycles for approval on those aspects. And so it's not a question of if, but when, but the when does become problematic for some of these projects if that drags out and there's no formal process for setting some shot clocks around that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we saw happen, and we had to take over projects for a few other people, was that these planning rules, like I said, they don't always jive well with building and safety rules. So I saw some things originally with like SB 9 where I had concerns about, when you draw property lines, a lot of things happen from a building and safety standpoint. So like fires, moving from technically one property to the next, things like that can cause a lot of issues.
Yeah, and I think that it leads into kind of next question around standards for the lots created under 684 SB 9 and how that plays in with things like flag lots and fire separation or fire access. You guys want to talk a little bit about that?
We found that oftentimes the fire department standards are kind of calling the shots here in terms of what's allowable from an SB 9 subdivision standpoint, because that's obviously an issue of health and safety. The thing that's odd is when there are things that local zoning departments can govern around, like minimum driveway sizes, even if it's not consistent with the local fire standards. And so it's kind of an arbitrary value. And that is something that we've flagged as kind of an interesting local standard that kind of can prevent some of these processes. And it's not, actually, a local fire department requirement.
Yeah, I have not done an SB 9, but I researched it pretty heavily when it came out. And I think the lesson from Los Angeles' small lot subdivision ordinance is that we really never did flag lots. We did everything through easements, which was an issue because typically you're required a level of frontage for a particular lot on a street. I know this is getting very technical, but so we would draw the map in the simplest way possible, and then everyone would have access to the street via car, via person, via easements only, and not try to draw these crazy lots.
Yeah. I know there's a ton of great questions in the chat, a lot of technical questions and some more just general questions. We are at time. I'm going to throw it back over to Raphael, but first I just want to let everyone know that we aren't just ignoring those questions. We're going to follow this up with a FAQ, whether that's on our social, IG Live or otherwise. So be on the lookout for that, and we'll be able to get to your questions through that. And I'll kick it back to Raphael.
All right, thank you. And yeah, as Jared said, although those are the questions we have time for, a lot of the questions have been answered in the Q&A, so take a peek at that. And also, thank you to all of our presenters and sponsors. And on behalf of the Casita Coalition, our thanks to everyone who attended here today. We invite other ADU and middle housing professionals, community-based organizations, and homeowners to add your voice and join the conversation by becoming a member or donating to the Casita Coalition at casitacoalition.org. You'll find lots of resources on our website, including our new SB 684 guidance memo and guidebooks on many subjects, including ADU finance and SB 9. You'll also find out our webinar library and on our YouTube channel, and many more resources for both ADU professionals and homeowners. You can keep up to date on all our events and stay informed with ADU and middle housing news by joining our mailing list or become a member at casitacoalition.org. Thank you and see you next time.